Hello, and thank you for watching this GeneMarkerHID webinar. My name is Adam Dillman, and today we're going to be talking about the Contamination Check tool in GeneMarkerHID. Now, this is an advanced application, so if you have not yet watched the GeneMarkerHID introductory webinar, I encourage you to go back and watch that first, and then come back to this webinar. Now, the Contamination Check tool is an embedded application within GeneMarkerHID, and it is a tool for automatically detecting sample contamination in your project. It does this by allowing you to create a customizable database full of technician profiles or any other profiles that you want to include that may come in contact with your sample files. The tool then allows you to compare those profiles in the database to the samples in your project, and it'll show you if there's any significant overlap. The Contamination Check tool will also allow you to compare each sample to each other sample in the project, thereby allowing you to check for cross-contamination. You can also customize the comparison parameters, and finally you can export the results. So now let's just jump right in and see an example. So now let's just jump right in and look at some examples of how we can use the Contamination Check tool. To get started here, I'm just going to open some data, and to do that I'm just going to go to File, Open Data. I'm going to click Add and navigate to some sample files here. And then I'm just going to select those files and click Open and OK. So right now we're of course just looking at the raw data. I'm going to process it by opening the Run Wizard. And then I'm just going to select my identifier template because these are identifier samples. And then I'm just going to click Next, Next, and OK. And of course, if you have any questions about processing samples, that's all covered in the introductory webinar. So at this point, I've now processed the data. Maybe normally I would go through and look at each sample and review them and look at the allele calls and the size calls and things like that. For now, I'm just going to skip through that and go straight to the Contamination Check tool so I can show that to you. And that's just under Project Contamination Check. Now, there's quite a lot to look at here, so we're just going to go through it piece by piece. Basically, all of the settings for the Contamination Check tool are up in this main toolbar. And what the Contamination Check tool does is it checks the samples in your project against each other and against other samples that may be in a database. It checks those samples against each other and does a similarity ratio calculation to show you how alike those samples are. And that, of course, could be an indication of some possible contamination. So all of these settings up here control basically how that comparison is done and with what samples. So you can see, for instance, that we can exclude certain samples from the comparison. We can exclude ladder samples or negative controls or positive controls or samples with more than a user-defined number of null markers. Next, over here, we can input a similarity ratio threshold. So basically, in this case, we'll only see samples with a similarity ratio greater than 60% or 50% or whatever you choose to input. This option down here allows us to specify a specific sample for comparison. So instead of comparing, A to B and B to C and C to D, we could just compare A to B, A to C, A to D. So basically, we would just compare a single sample against all the other samples, as opposed to comparing all the samples to each other. Over here we can determine the different match types, so we can compare the samples in a project with themselves, or we could also compare the samples in a project against a database, and you can choose the relationship database or the contamination database. And then, of course, over here you can choose if you want to display the file name or the sample name. And then there's some icons down here as well. The most important one that I want to talk about right now is just this little binocular icon. That's just kind of the refresh/search button. So you click that to kind of update the results. So to get started, all I'm going to do, just as an example, is I'm just going to do a within project or kind of intra-project similarity calculation first. So I'm just going to do within the project, I'm going to do all samples, so I'm going to deselect this, and I want to show samples with a similarity ratio greater than, let's say, 40%. So after I put that in, I'm just going to click the binocular icon and search. So now I can see all of these results here. And for each sample, I'm seeing the sample name, the reference sample, or the sample that it's being compared against, and then the matched number. This is the number of alleles that they have in common, the number of alleles the reference sample has, and then the similarity ratio. So you can see here the highest percentage I have is 81.48%. So that means that they share more than 4/5 of the same alleles. So that would obviously be an indicator of some kind of contamination. These columns can be sorted just by clicking on the column header. So for instance, if I click on reference sample, that will sort the samples alphanumerically by the reference sample. Match number, I can do the same way. Similarity ratio, I can organize them from least to greatest or greatest to least. Just to show another way of using this, let's this time use a specific sample. So this time I'm going to use a specific sample, and this time use pat_10_C1. I'll refresh the results, and this time you can see my comparison sample is always pat_C1 or _10_C1. And in this case, there were only 3 cases in which the similarity ratio was greater than 40%. So this time I'm going to change again, and I'm going to search within a database. I'm going to search within the contamination database. Now, a little bit about the contamination database. You can submit samples to the contamination database by clicking this submit icon. And when you do that, you'll see all the samples in your current project. If you scroll over to the right, you will see their genotypes. And you can submit those samples to the database just by clicking on the submit icon. You can also upload profiles as a text file in cases where the original HID or FSA files are not available and you happen to have the profiles archived. You can edit the samples in the database by just clicking on this little edit icon. And you can see I have 4 samples here that I just sort of made up just for demonstration, but I have Bob Smith, and here's his profile. I have a person named Sarah Jones, here's their profile, and then I have a secretary and my technician 1 profiles. So I'm just trying to give some examples of some of the type of people that you would maybe include in your contamination database, people that are actually working with the samples on a day-to-day basis, or pretty much anybody in the institution that could potentially contaminate the samples. So I had these individuals' genotypes and I submitted them to my database. So now let's go ahead and search the samples in my current project against the samples in my contamination database. And I'll just use all the samples this time. So when I search against the contamination database, here are the results I get. You'll notice that the reference sample, if it comes from a database, it has this little prefix DB. And it's virtually the same. I can see the similarity ratios. And in this case, these samples actually have 100% similarity ratio because I actually just renamed them with a different name. So these are actually identical samples, and then these samples have quite a bit in common. I also just wanted to point out that you can do your comparison with the database and the project at the same time. So for instance, all I have to do is just click both of these checkboxes, refresh my results, and now you can see I have a tab for my within project comparisons and my with database comparisons. That's basically how the contamination database works. It's just a fast and effective way to compare the genotypes of your comparison samples with the samples that are also in that project, or samples that are in a contamination database or your relationship testing database. From here, of course, maybe we could decide to redo a reaction or further analyze a certain sample. Finally, you can export these results just by clicking the save icon. That'll just give you the opportunity to save this table as it appears as an Excel or a text file. So thank you for watching, and just stick around to find out how you can get more information about Soft Genetics products. Thank you for your interest in GeneMarkerHID and for watching this GeneMarkerHID webinar. For more information or for a free 30-day trial of GeneMarkerHID and other Soft Genetics products, please visit our website at softgenetics.com or just send an email to info@softgenetics.com. Of course, you can always send any technical support questions to tech_support@softgenetics.com. Thanks for watching.